I will clean after, before the meeting starts. Sorry, if you want, I can clean after, before the meeting starts. I'm just going to leave the sandwiches there. And after everything finishes, maybe someone is going to.
Yeah, that's exactly what I
Yeah, okay. So, don't worry. I mean, you can deal with the technology stuff.
Hi.
Trump gets reelected, that will be probably the most document.
Yeah, next time we want to.
Yeah, these are those are.
Oh, you were meant how people would work. I was thinking of their house is totally different. I don't know how they.
Welcome, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That's
Option one.
Oh,
Finish them. No. Yeah.
Nothing changed with the order. You were first and then.
oh, okay.
But I'm happy to.
No, there was because the follow online. Some noise here with us.
Colleagues, we are back to our seminar on reforming Europe and the discussion of the Draghi Report. And let me introduce the second panel for the discussion. First of all, very own Johanna Gauthier-Morin, the historian of capitalism and economic knowledge, and currently a research fellow in the Department of International Relations at the Central European University. Johanna was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. She has published on the debt crisis, economic reforms, and the history of economic ideas. And her book manuscript traces the global history of financial deregulation from a gender and post-colonial perspective. We will also have two colleagues online, Francesco Sassi. Dr. Francesco Sassi is a research fellow in energy geopolitics and markets at the Research Institute in Bologna called Industrial and Energy Research. He collaborates with the energy security focus of the Italian Parliament and the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. His research looks at the Eurasian geopolitical dynamics, decarbonization of the gas sector, and the relations between the government, state-owned enterprises, and markets. And last but not least, Noah Gordon, who is an acting co-director of the Sustainability, Climate and Geopolitics Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. His research focuses on climate change and how it is changing international politics. Before joining Carnegie, Noah Gordon worked as an advisor at the Berlin-based climate think tank Adelphi. He was a fellow at the London-based think tank, the Center for European Reform, and a parliamentary assistant in the Bundestag. And we'll start with Johanna, with you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Some of the things I'm going to say might be redundant at some point because we obviously all did our homework to analyze this report, and but I try really to focus on the problem of the ecological transition. So the Draghi Report proposes a joint plan for decarbonization and economic competitiveness, as well as initiatives to boost security, reduce dependencies, and close the innovation gap. Okay, we've said it so much, but it opens with a strong call to action. If Europe aims to protect prosperity, sustainability, and peace, it must restore economic competitiveness. The solution is to achieve competitiveness through decarbonization. And obviously, this can happen only through massive investment to expand clean energy generation and transmission, which could ultimately lower energy costs for households and businesses. This approach would inherently boost the competitiveness of European industries. However, a critical question remains. Should Europe pursue rapid decarbonization at the risk of maintaining economic dependency on more competitive nations, or rather focus on long-term investment at the cost of immediate progress? Several important issues remain unaddressed, raising concerns that the report's priorities may be somewhat contradictory. And I propose here to examine two key aspects through an environmental lens. The first being the complexity of European environmental regulations, and the second question and European carbon markets. And I will briefly conclude, maybe in this redundant but complementary point, addressing the issue of political will, of lack thereof, to drive European decarbonization. So Draghi's report highlights administrative complexity as a barrier to European productivity, advocating for regulatory simplification in the private sector, especially concerning environmental policies, while questioning newly introduced regulations whose impacts and administrative costs are not yet fully understood, which may seem controversial. These frameworks are part of a polyphonic coherence. It's aimed at establishing a shared language around environmental impact measurement and reduction. For example, the European taxonomy for sustainable activities established under the European Green Deal proposes a classification system to clarify which economic activities are environmentally sustainable and has become central to various European directives. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, for example, requires large and listed companies to report regularly on the social and environmental risks they face, as well as their impact on people and the environment. This taxonomy aims to prevent greenwashing, guiding sustainable investment decisions, and influencing global regulatory trends. The do no significant harm principle, adopted by the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, for example, exemplifies early regulatory convergence beyond the EU borders. So rather than layering one framework over another, the goal is often to adapt a broad ambition to specific contexts. It is also worth noting that many standards applied to businesses are voluntary, such as the Carbon Disclosure Project for reporting, for example. This is an international non-profit initiative that promotes environmental reporting and risk management as business norms. There is also the Science-Based Targets Initiative for Climate Goals, which is a collaboration between the Carbon Disclosure Project I just mentioned and the United Nations Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature to support companies in setting emission reduction goals aligned with net zero targets by 2050. However, these standards often overlook the realities faced by Europe, small and medium-sized enterprises, as Draghi laments, which may lack the resources to fully implement them. And it is true that these businesses frequently express that these standards impose disproportionate burdens being designed for larger companies. But in response, the report suggests raising applicability thresholds and implementing a proportional framework for these small and medium-sized enterprises in both current and future regulations. It also proposes delaying or even eliminating regulations where administrative costs overweight expected benefits. So overall, the report largely assumes a competitive, non-cooperative global transition scenario, emphasizing competition over resources and a reliance on technological innovation to overcome environmental challenges and sustain growth. Its lack of explicit discussion on the environmental and socioeconomic implications of these assumptions may lead to suboptimal economic decisions. For example, it does not take into account other environmental aspects, such as enhancing biodiversity, reducing pollution, sustainable agriculture, or supporting a circular economy. All factors of economic and social health beyond GDP on which the report primarily relies. In aiming to simplify Europe's green industrialization, the Draghi Report indirectly encourages loosening environmental regulations. That's a little bit my reading of it. It seems evident that the approach behind current regulations requires rethinking, because to date, regulations have focused on transparency, reporting, and prohibitions, which has kind of locked regulators into a restrictive perspective. So shifting toward an incentive-based approach that would encourage ambitious companies would require a unified European framework, maybe defining what we understand as sustainable futures, which would be the concluding point of the political discussion that we need to have to define sustainable futures. But to move on the economic aspect of it, to support its economic and ecological ambitions, the report proposes indeed a substantial investment plan of 800 billion annually. So as our colleague pointed out, 5% of EU's GDP, with more than half allocated to ecological transition. The goal is to decarbonize the energy mix, reducing electricity prices and bolstering Europe's position in clean technology. The promise is clear: invest massively to boost productivity, especially in areas where the EU lags, while simultaneously supporting an ambitious ecological transition by investing in future-oriented technologies. The underlying assumption is that the European economy will manage to combine economic growth with respect for planetary boundaries, decoupling growth from resource consumption. Although early signs of decoupling from CO2 emissions are emerging, it remains unclear whether this will be enough to achieve carbon neutrality. The lack of a clear carbon pricing trajectory complicates investment prioritization, despite the EU carbon market being the primary climate policy tool in this report. Carbon trading is indeed central to European climate policy and may become one of the world's largest commodities markets. The EU emissions trading scheme, the world's largest carbon market, has adopted a framework for certifying high-quality carbon removals that aims to address three things: the difficulty in assessing and comparing the quality of those removals, the lack of trust in existing carbon removal certificates, that is, voluntary carbon credits, and the barriers faced by providers of carbon removals to access finance. But this framework only applies to removals within the EU. So as such, it may cover only a small share of credits in the broader carbon market. However, environmentalists argue that the European emission trading scheme has consistently failed to cap emissions. In an open letter to the European Commission, Carbon Market Watch, the non-profit watchdog that oversees the carbon pricing plans and climate policies of governments and corporations, criticized policymakers for overemphasizing carbon markets as a solution, contending that markets are poorly suited to stimulate carbon removal technologies. Lately, investment strategies that prioritize environmental, social, and governance standards, the famous ESG standards, have become more controversial. The ESG funds have drawn criticism from investors and from right-wing political groups for prioritizing environmental goals over returns. And the potential legal ramifications, on the other hand, of using carbon credits have also grown. In May 2023, if you remember or not, but it was the beginning of a massive class action lawsuit in California against Delta Airlines, arguing that the airline misrepresented itself as a carbon neutral based on problematic carbon offsets. This fits a growing trend that is hitting also Europe. And if you count from 2015 until 2022, the latest open lawsuits that you can find in the press, almost 81 climate washing cases have been filed against companies. So these challenges point to problems in both the supply and demand sides of carbon markets. Ensuring that carbon credits represent genuine, additional, and lasting emission reductions remains a core challenge. And there are multiple independent standard organizations that use different methodologies to certify projects and credits. So this heterogeneity complicates efforts to certify projects and prevents buyers from clear views on the quality or of different credits. There is also uncertainty on the demand side. The way in which companies use credits to achieve net zero goals matters. While organizations like the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative advocate for buyers to use credits as a supplement to overarching decarbonization pathways, there is little to no direction for how best to use credits and what claims can be made. The lack of transparency on the usage of carbon offsets complicates efforts to improve the credibility of voluntary arrangements. Beyond mobilizing unprecedented investment amounts, balancing these contradictory imperatives remains the greatest challenge and political challenge in Mario Draghi's roadmap. Europe faces a political trilemma between security, sustainability, and prosperity, where pursuing one goal often requires sacrificing the others. Which brings me to this question of EU's political will or its absence to change, actually. Because while Draghi's plan may be subject to debate, it underscores the necessity of unprecedented political mobilization to achieve Europe's decarbonization goals. Von der Leyen has announced plans to base the new clean industrial deal on Draghi's proposals, and yet European leaders seem to struggle to politically challenge this plan amid widespread political instability in most member states. Draghi acknowledges that necessary reforms will only be durable and ambitious with strong democratic backing. This need is particularly pressing as climate policies face growing opposition from populist ranks. At the national level, the 2025 update of European countries' long-term climate strategies should serve as a milestone for redefining ambitious and coordinated climate policies, crucial for meeting global and European climate objectives. And in that sense, substantial public investments may be necessary to support businesses and individuals in this transition. But to improve social acceptance of these policies, promoting bottom-up approaches may be better solutions. There are already a few citizen involvement initiatives, like climate citizens assemblies in Ireland, Luxembourg, Denmark, or here in Austria, that engage various social groups in environmental policy development that could maybe aid in advancing the transition. There are other examples of citizen-led renewable energy projects to transform living spaces into homes that are energy efficient and eco-friendly, involving local governments, citizens, and businesses. So why not? These initiatives might accelerate the decarbonization of the energy mix while fostering local participation and dynamizing communities. But obviously there are few of them, and we are not really driving the whole ecological transition right now. So to conclude, the ecological transition has maybe reached this crucial phase with this report, because environmental impacts are becoming tangible on a large scale, as we've witnessed here with the storm Boris in Central Europe. And at the same time, economic sacrifices that require prompting, that are maybe a bit suggested by this report, are actually facing resistance everywhere in Europe. If you think of the Yellow Vest movement in France or the protest by farmers in Poland, this highlights really a fundamental democratic issue that the transition cannot proceed without public support. So in contrast to the report's approach, emblematic maybe of this technocratic methodology that has characterized the European Union so far, it is crucial to foster a new common approach. And this would involve iterative exchanges between maybe more scientific rigor, administrative self-reflection, and citizen engagement, elements that might currently be missing from the EU's approach. So on the one hand, this requires enhancing awareness of available tools and resources among economic actors so that they can embrace the transition and participate more actively in the debate. But on the other hand, as Draghi rightly emphasizes, half measures are no longer viable, and Europe must undergo this radical change and embrace political mobilization to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Johanna. It's interesting that you mentioned that these half approaches, they no longer work. Also, our colleagues mentioned that politicians, they really like their cherry picking. Draghi Report gives you various policies, and politicians would probably tend to pick some of them that they like or that they know that they can implement, but forget about others. But the whole thing works only if it's done as a whole, right? Right, so now we have Dr. Francesco Sassi. Francesco, are you online?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. The floor is yours. I have 20 minutes.
Thank you. Actually, I will use less than that. I'll share my screen with you just for a very brief presentation. Okay. So thanks again for the invitation. It's great to be here today with you all. When I was invited to the discussion of today, I was thinking about how to approach the Draghi report from my perspective, which is energy geopolitics, of course, and how energy geopolitics fits into the Draghi report. As an Italian and having had Draghi as a prime minister during the very first year of the energy crisis in Europe was very interesting, and it gave us as Italian a little more insight on how such highly respected politician in Europe was thinking about how to solve the energy crisis from the perspective of a country so much reliant on hydrocarbons, so much reliant on natural gas, and a country that had so many problems in deploying an energy transition with the pace of other European countries such as Spain or Germany. So again, I think that the Draghi report gives to a European audience what we as Italians have already seen by his policies during the first year of his government. So I'd like today to focus on two main things. One is the timing of a report, which is, I think, very important in the context of energy geopolitics and how understanding how European authorities are thinking about this scenario, this energy geopolitical scenario, but also on the content of the report, and having some conclusion that we can also discuss later in the panel. I went through the report and also read a lot of critical analysis of the report from Draghi. It's very it is very curious, the timing of report, the release of the report. It was discussed. It had to came out before the EU elections. It was delayed several times actually, and many critics of Draghi told us that actually it came too late to be relevant for the EU elections, and if it had came before EU elections, it would have countered the interest of the Ursula von der Leyen alliance, actually, and especially the green forces within the current alliance that supports the von der Leyen Commission. There is a very interesting phrasing by Draghi when he speaks about the European Green Deal. He mentions the European Green Deal just once in the whole report, which is striking if you think about how strategic the Green Deal is for this Commission. And he says that most importantly, the European Green Deal was premised on the creation of a new green jobs. So its political sustainability could be in danger if decarbonization leads instead to the deindustrialization in Europe, including the industries that can support the green transition. So actually, when we right now look at what is happening at the green industry, at the green industries and clean energy industries in Europe, actually we are already seeing this trend, at least in the last couple of years. The clean energy industry in Europe is losing the competitive race with China, especially. So actually, this is a very bad picture for how the Green Deal is actually developing in Europe, because Draghi says that losing the credibility will be the first consequence if Europe loses the race for creating new green jobs in the continent. And so the report comes after the EU Parliament elections. The publication has been delayed several times, but also it comes after 2 years where 2 or 3 years where the US lost industrial prowess to competitors. So it is actually a little too late for this report to be substantial and change the course of the EU industrial policies, and especially when it is related to green jobs that are actually moving from the EU to other continents, not just to China, but also to the US because of the IRA. And we will talk maybe later about what is happening in the US right now. Another very important phrase and caption taken from the Draghi report is if Europe cannot become more productive, we will be forced we will be forced to choose. We will not be able to become at once a leader in new technologies, a beacon of climate responsibility, and an independent player on the world stage. We will not be able to finance our social model. We will have to scale back some, if not all, of our ambitions. And this is also a very scary perspective from the Draghi Report. It suggests more political tensions will rise if the EU model fails. And we are already seeing that happening in some EU countries, especially in countries such as Austria, such as Germany. We will maybe have some time later to discuss these, but we are seeing parties outside the governments, the traditional governments in these countries, gaining more votes because of their positions against renewables, against taking climate actions as a priority in their policy making. But also we are seeing industrial leadership here in the Draghi Report that equals to our political independency. But at the same time, energy markets and energy trade are based on energy interdependencies. So again, I think this is a very paradoxical way of approaching the importance of markets, the importance of finance, the importance of interdependency in general, because energy interdependencies are a cornerstone of the European approach to energy markets, energy trade, and also the possibility of bolstering the renewable transition in Europe, because actually we are now very much dependent, or we could say interdependent with other continents, industries, supply chains, and the major example is obviously China, because without solar panels from China, without wind turbines from China that are now increasing their share in the EU market, will not be able to have renewable energy projects as competitive as how we are having them right now in the continent. Also, let's talk about the content of the Draghi Report. It is very interesting that renewables are absolutely mentioned hundreds of times in the Draghi Report, but we are actually not finding many references to two key energy source for the EU energy mix. One, the first is nuclear energy. It is only mentioned 6 times in the whole report. And actually, right now, we are discussing about relaunching the nuclear industry in Europe. So again, it's somehow paradoxical that the nuclear energy is mentioned as a very important energy source, but only together with renewables. And actually, we are seeing that nuclear energy in some EU countries is so relevant, is so much relevant that it has to be at least mentioned as an independent energy source, even compared to the role of renewables, which is very important in some energy mixes. But certainly for a country such as France, nuclear energy is absolutely fundamental to allow the prosecution of the energy transition, but also the security of energy supplies. So again, the relaunching of the industry is not investigated in depth in the Draghi Report. We read about the necessity to support somehow the industry, but Draghi doesn't talk about how to do so, even from a European perspective and not from a national perspective, which is also very concerning, because if we will have only nuclear nations in Europe supporting this industry, we will not have a European revival of nuclear power, but only a national revival of nuclear power, which is also which also suggests the possibility of centrifugal forces for European energy policies instead of a European energy union. And also the same situation in France, which is absolutely pivotal when we are talking about the European nuclear industry, is not investigated in the report. France had severe problems with the nuclear industry over the last couple of years, especially in 2022 and in the first half of 2023. We found the French nuclear industry, a European revival of nuclear is almost impossible. And the paradoxical effect is that without the French industry, we will become more dependent on other non-European nuclear industries. So again, this is also a paradox of the Draghi Report. And last but not least, natural gas, the role of natural gas is investigated in the Draghi Report. It is mentioned just 6 times again in the whole report. But the photograph, the existing photograph of the industrial and retail price gap between Europe and other markets such as China and the US is mentioned many times as a source of industrial uncompetitiveness in Europe. And this is a very concerning point that Draghi raises in his report again several times. It is also very interesting that Draghi mentions the possibility of joint purchasing of natural gas from the EU. The EU in the report is mentioned as the largest global gas and LNG importer. And actually, this is a very also contradictory statement, because if you're looking at EU as a singular entity, yes, this is true, but we are losing and reducing our volumes of imported LNG, and so we are also losing our bargaining power with countries that are exporting and producing and exporting natural gas to Asian countries mainly, and mainly towards China, which is also a country that has the access to cheaper natural gas sources compared to Europe, and this is also shown in the Draghi Report. So again, interdependence here becomes a key term, a key concept. I think we should approach and investigate how to solve this energy crisis, because in the Draghi Report, he doesn't mention how Europe could generate new, safe, secure interdependencies, gas interdependencies. And this is maybe because the European Union is trying to do everything it could to decrease in the natural gas consumption. We had over the last couple of years around 20% of a reduction of natural gas consumption compared to the previous 5 years. So this is an exceptional reduction in the natural gas consumption. But also the report says that natural gas will stay in the European energy mix in the medium term. So how could we become stronger? How could we access cheaper natural gas if we are at the same time saying that we will buy less natural gas in the future, and we are not also stating to natural gas exported that we will be their partners for the future time being. And this is also not discussed in the Draghi Report and find very little space in the European discussion at all, I would say. Just very briefly about some conclusions. Energy geopolitics has become a primary variable in shaping global security, economic, and climate strategies, and that is staying for long in our future. But also, geopolitical tensions easily influence market trends and will continue to do so in the future. And these issues will have a lot of implications for the industrial competitiveness of the EU, which will hinge on the ability of having cheaper energy inputs. And right now, it is hard to see renewables responding alone to this need. It is also, I think, unrealistic to expect peaceful developments in the realm of energy geopolitics in the next 5 years. The possibility of Trump's re-election is not discussed. How could this influence energy geopolitics? What about the implications of for Europe of US-China tensions? This is not discussed in the report. And these tensions will also increase under an Harris administration, not just with Trump. So this is also some other issues that I think will need to be discussed at EU level. And I also think, and this is my perspective, that climate policies, energy strategies, industrial strategies, and foreign policies will need to stay under the same umbrella for a successful European initiative to regain industrial competitiveness in the future. And as I had said maybe before, I think that in the Draghi Report, these issues are not very well structured together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco. And you mentioned that there is a unknown variable here, whether it will be a Trump administration or a Harris administration. And now we have Noah Gordon, who is based in Washington, D.C. Maybe he also mentioned a sort of American perspective on what we are discussing today in Europe. Thank you, Francesco. And Noah, you have 20 minutes. Welcome.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And, Francesco, Johanna, and the other speakers have covered the Draghi Report so well that I'll make some points about that, but it would be hard not to focus on US or a transatlantic angle, sitting here in DC the day before an election. One point I wanted to pick up from the Draghi Report, there's a really interesting section about differentiating between different sectors. It says EU industrial policy must distinguish between 4 cases, basically cases where the EU is so far behind and can't compete, cases where the EU needs the local jobs to come with it and so should consider joint ventures and licensing agreements and so on. Another one where the EU needs resilience in case of geopolitical tensions and must have production capacities within its borders. And then fourth, infant industries where there are well-known options for protecting these and allowing them to scale up. And this differentiation is really important, and it's something that the US is coming to a bit late as well. If you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, it basically provided subsidies for a whole range, for every aspect of the energy transition, all sorts of clean energy. You got batteries, electrolyzers, carbon capture, solar, wind, and it's unlikely that America will be, or Europe would be able to compete in all of these sectors. I mean, you look at even projections, we talk about China controlling 80 to 90% of battery production today and of solar panels today. If you look at the projections, that's unlikely to change with the current generation technologies. And so it should lead to questions about, for one, the possibility of leapfrogging. If China's success on lithium-ion batteries means it's too hard to catch them, then perhaps resources would be better spent trying to jump ahead to solid-state batteries. Or you could compare solar and batteries and think about, solar panels are low margin, there wouldn't be serious costs if they were cut off. Perhaps it'd be better to focus on batteries and be happy with a higher degree of imports of solar panels. This is a discussion that is just starting to take shape, I think, in both contexts, as both the US and Europe realize how far behind they are, especially the US, and try to think about where public dollars could be best spent and which industries should receive the most support. Another piece of the report that I picked up on was the complaints about the EU's lack of coordination across policies, that sometimes investment policy, tax policy, regulation policy weren't working together. That's interesting to read from Washington. The US obviously has a much greater ability to borrow and to invest, but its ability to regulate is in greater question. There are a lot of veto points there as well, and with an obstructionist Supreme Court, it can be difficult to regulate, and that's why the Inflation Reduction Act was infamously almost all carrots and basically no sticks. Some of the other clean energy policies of interest in the Draghi report, you do see some ideas that are further along in Japan and perhaps the US as well. I mean, the report calls for considering stockpiling minerals, perhaps some physical stockpiles, or just basically a price insurance to reduce the volatility and try to stop things like lithium mines closing in Australia because China produces so much and the price falls. These are interesting ideas that I think could be pursued transatlantically. I mean, the model is something like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is coordinated by the IEA, and you could imagine this being multilateral as well. There is some interest in the Dilip Singh wrote a piece, that the National Economic Advisor here wrote a piece calling for basically a strategic petroleum reserve, but for minerals. That's an idea that's been picked up by the U.S. Department of Energy as well, a price insurance model or offtake agreements. And you could imagine something like that happening through the IEA or NATO or G7 or otherwise. The report also talks about what you might call foreign green industrial policy. And there, the U.S. is finally getting into the game. The Development Finance Corporation, which is actually set up under Trump, is making investments abroad, including equity investments in, for example, the mining firm TechMet, which has assets in Africa and South America. And the U.S. government basically owns 15% of it now. This is something that both parties are interested in scaling up, and could be a model for Europe as well to match what China is doing. For context there, one of my main projects at Carnegie is the U.S. Foreign Policy for Clean Energy Task Force. It's a regular gathering of bipartisan officials, past and probably future, that talks about what the U.S. could do abroad to complete the IRA and strengthen the global supply chains that the U.S. relies on. And you do see focus on the Development Finance Corporation, this U.S. body that can actually make equity investments, as something that has bipartisan approval and could be scaled up next year. Since the election is tomorrow, I mean, I should say one of those task force sessions, it was interesting to see a former White House official who just recently left saying the U.S. needs something like a Draghi report, that the U.S. also needs this level of coordination and one report that could bring together its foreign green industrial policy. And as we wait to find out this week whether Harris or Trump wins, I think it's important to admit that we're likely to be stuck with this sort of all of the above America First energy policy for a while, whoever wins. The Democrats, which are the only party that seriously acknowledges climate change and has policies to address it, still have to brag about U.S. record oil and gas consumption. Like, we are a long way from any sort of supply restrictions or trying to do things to make this an energy transition rather than an energy addition. You see, and there you get to a question that Alexander and Akos asked me to touch on, is about the role of competition compared to coordination. And it's been competition that has driven most of the U.S. recent advances in clean energy industrial policy, especially with China. You see the reason that the Inflation Reduction Act passed is because the senator from West Virginia, Joe Manchin, said he didn't want critical minerals being controlled by China. You see the complaints about China, what we call Chinese overcapacity, even in sectors like solar panels, where that seems to be a ludicrous idea that we can have overcapacity in solar panels when you're focused on emissions. It may be true from the perspective of a manufacturer. And you see the outcry over something as minimal as the temporary pause that the U.S. put on future LNG terminals to be added in the 2030s. That ended up being scaled back. It was attacked by Republican attorneys general. What I mean to say is that we're a long way from any sort of policies to scale down fossil fuel production in the U.S. And you just see some of the differences between the U.S., which is a major oil and gas producer, and the EU, which for the most part isn't, and how that affects the policies that come out of it. And if you think about where competition can help, it's helped. It's one reason China is leading the transition and thankfully producing the clean energy products that the world relies on, has more EVs than the rest of the world combined. Competition can really help with adding clean energy and perhaps with adaptation, but it's not going to help us actually displace fossil fuels or have, the US stop pumping oil or China stop burning coal. So you see the limits of competition, even though it's actually competition that has achieved what we've done so far on the mitigation side. And as a last point, I don't think I'll need my 20 minutes, but I hope to contribute in the Q&A session as well and respond to the others. One thing that, Johanna mentioned negative emissions a little bit, but when you think about climate change, it's so easy to go between despair and hope when you see, oh, we're on track for 3 degrees, but we're also breaking, Chinese emissions may peak this year, EU emissions fell 8% last year. But what we call the carbon dioxide removal gap is so large, and it's sort of like the big lie of climate politics at the moment. We are so far off track. We keep building more and more negative emissions into our models, planning to overshoot and overshoot temperature targets and then scale back, even though we may cross tipping points in the meantime. We just heard last week from scientists about the risk of the collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning current. And this is something that neither the US nor China nor the EU is properly working on. And if carbon dioxide removal is as far off as it is, we did some analysis that found it would have to scale up by 18 million%. That's not a typo, 18 million% by 2035 for us to be on track. If that's off track, then all of our other production targets are actually wrong as well. We're not as close as we need to be on solar, on batteries. Talking about overcapacity doesn't make sense because we would have to build up clean energy so fast as to be able to displace the current fossil fuel production. So just want to leave on that point to see if we'll return to it later, or if Johanna has more to say about, bringing negative emissions into EU carbon markets. So those are some of my responses to the Draghi report, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Noah. Do we have questions? Because this is the last presentation, and we will go into a general discussion.
Yeah. This question for Noah. Could Noah give a little bit more color to the 18 million% figure? Like, what would it mean sort of practically?
Sure. Some more context on that. So what we're doing in the task force, we did something called an ex-China framework to try to figure out if, for better or worse, the US and its allies are going for, let's say, a partial decoupling or a de-risking of supply chains. And if you were to hold China to its current share of production plus its share of GDP, which is about 18%, what would the US and partners need to produce across all of these clean energy supply chains? We looked at solar, looked at wind, looked at batteries. And what the targets are set according to the IEA's net zero pathway. And so it's about what the US and allies need to produce in 2035. And on some of these sectors, the world is close to on track. I mean, when we talk about solar, like the world as a whole, and even countries outside of China are poised to produce quite a lot of solar panels. I think we were something like 90% on track. Batteries as well, between 70 and 80% on track for what we need in 2035. And it's when you look at the less talked about sectors, you could even talk about clean fertilizer, sustainable aviation fuels, where the EU is better, green steel. We're further and further off track. And then you get to carbon dioxide removal. I think our analysis looked at direct air capture, which is likely to be used more than BECCS at this stage. And that's where our current amount of direct air capture was so risible that we needed to scale up by 18 million%. You have to completely break the graph. I can send it over later, but we're just kind of nowhere. One of the US's only major pipelines for storing carbon dioxide is now leaking and has to be shut down. It's just an area where competition cannot. This is where you do have climate change as sort of it's a collective action problem, or as a issue where you have free riding. I mean, you might have a country decide to produce batteries to make it richer and safer and make its air cleaner and control global supply chains, but since there are no direct and local benefits to removing carbon dioxide, it's just not an area where countries are pushing ahead, and we're really, really far off track. And I think we have to worry about how many negative emissions we are building into our models. The recent book, Overshoot by Andreas Malm and Wim Carton, I thought was really good on this, is that it's not plausible, and it's sort of our get out of jail free card at the moment. But I think we have to think seriously about whether it's realistic that we're going to remove as much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as we claim. I mean, the climate scientist David Ho does a sort of funny bit on Twitter when he will respond to the announcement of a new carbon dioxide removal project by tweeting, "Oh, great, this will take us back 20 minutes at current rates of emissions." I mean, that's the sort of scale when we talk about removing a few thousand tons or megatons when we're emitting about 40 gigatons per year just from energy alone. So I will hunt down the number for you, but The point of the 18 million is just that we're sort of nowhere, unlike with solar or batteries, where we're doing quite well.
I have a question, suggestion. So we discussed in the first panel the newest report submitted to the commission, composed by the former Finnish president Saula Niinistö, the Niinistö report. I highly recommend to look at that. That's kind of a complement to the Draghi report because Niinistö looks at security and geopolitical issues. And of course, both reports present a European perspective on the events. You present your American perspective, which is very, very welcome. But the European perspective is not really about collective action. It's like about sort of leadership claim at some point, and that was marked by the new Green Deal, by the European Green Deal. And we discussed here that these debates, and Western actually helped us a lot to understand how it works. The current debates show a sort of disappointment or retreat from those energetic claims for leadership in the energy transition. And you mentioned this relation between carrots and sticks. I'm trying to connect these dots, but indeed, like in the Inflation Reduction Act, that was mostly carrots. While I think in the European Green Deal, sticks were also present, but they were addressed to the foreign suppliers of energy, to the petrostates essentially, from the Near East or Russia. So sticks were because any reduction of carbon goods in Europe would lead to decrease of incomes of the supplying states, right? Which doesn't work the same way in the United States because it's self-supplied. So there is no. So this kind of division between carrots and sticks that Europe managed to achieve, the United States didn't need to produce or was not able to produce because that's all carried within the country. So the sticks addressed against the petrostates, we say the wars in precisely those parts of the world, surrounding Europe from the east and from the south. So these petrostates respond to the sticks that were initially there in the program. Were they realized or not? That's a different issue. Yeah. So do you see this kind of? I mean, in this Niinistö report, actually, what is the newest word of European politics? It was published just last week. So I actually see some responses, or at least some discussion of this particular position of Europe and its relation to the foreign actors and suppliers, and now petro aggressors. So I'm really interested how that would. I mean, elections. I think this is a kind of level of discussion of debate at which the American elections will not be even important. That will kind of stay with us, whatever happens there. But we need to debate it and start discussing it along, say, with the spectacular reports to the European Commission.
Yeah, I do need to take a look at that report. It's interesting what you say about the EU using sticks against petrostates. It's another one of the sort of hypocrisies of US policy. The US is quite happy to use sticks against other petrostates. I mean, the US has sanctions on many of the world's oil producers and often advocates, for example, for US LNG exports by pointing out how dirty Russian pipeline gas is or other LNG is. So the US is willing to use sticks against other petrostates, but as you said, both parties are bragging about US record oil and gas production. So that there's no change there on the agenda. I wanted to pick up on what you said about leadership claims. As we return to this issue of competition and whether it can drive climate action, it was kind of interesting to see after Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement in 2020, you saw China not withdraw itself or roll back its claims, but actually she proclaimed the carbon neutrality goal by 2060. So China sort of moved there to take up the mantle of climate leadership. And I wonder, as the climate crisis gets more salient and we see more, the heat wave deaths at the Hajj, the floods in Spain last week, more and more of these crises, whether there can be more geopolitical benefits from being seen as a climate leader. Not, with climate finance and emission reductions. On the security side, there's an interesting section of the US National Intelligence Estimate on climate change, I think from 2021. It had two new risks for the US. These were high security risks to the US in the 2030s. They were first, insufficient emission reductions, and second, a failure of technology transfer and climate finance. So there's some recognition there that if the US continues to be the climate laggard and a sort of a petrostate itself, if you will, that this will come back to hurt the US and undermine its legitimacy and its alliances and the institutions that it dominates. So there's a possibility there of there being some sort of benefits to climate leadership on the diplomatic stage.
More questions? Could also, since we are now in the general discussion, the question can be addressed to Vesta, Rizana, Johanna, or Francesco as well. Yeah.
I think to pick up on this leadership position in earlier mentions we had on rankings, it's a question that has been occupying my mind throughout our workshop. Very naively, I was a bit shocked when I read the report to see that the entire intellectual framework was based on ranking and that old good GDP and all these ways of seeing the world that for me seemed completely out of pace with the climate urgency and the problem of Earth habitability. So it was interesting, Noah, when you mentioned all these approaches to the global approach, really, that makes you think of what a country should do with the idea that other countries are also doing things and that the national scale is really not the right scale to read the problem in the world right now. But at the same time, obviously, geopolitics are many by states, so we are a bit locked in this problem. But this is surprising coming from the European Commission, where this is the potentially only political experiment that we can actually do to finally unlock from the national scale and think a bit differently. And still, here we are, and we can't do that apparently. So I would love to have all your thoughts on this, because that's a problem that keeps me up at night sometimes.
It's a good point. I think also, European politics are basically dominated by country politics still. And the council and the individual member states, they are very defining in what the EU can and cannot do. So, for example, what I mentioned earlier with the access to information, for example, how can you gauge that the investments made are actually working? There's just a really big lacuna there and an unwillingness from countries and companies to share that information, to be open about that, and to sort of, for the EU to be able to build on collective action, you have to know what the effects of your policies are, and we just don't know, right? So we're spending hundreds of billions, and it's very unclear if it's actually spent, if it's deployed, if it's only allocated, it all gets refracted through the ministries. They do not have the information available for EU to gauge its actions. I think the EU has a massive capacity problem they don't like to talk about as well. So, I mean, if you look at the reconstruction funds and the level of knowledge at the DGs, it's pretty limited because they rely on either auditors or they rely on the governments to provide that information. And even with the planning, you know, these were 700-page documents, and I understood from the commission they had 2 days to read them, and they had 4 people going over it. I mean, you can make a sort of, you have an idea about the policies, but you have to go into the nitty-gritty to know what actual the effects are going to be, right? And yeah, that's, I think, where it really refracts into sort of all these different little policies again, because it's still so married to the national sovereignty, and that would be my sort of sense here.
Yeah, this competitiveness and no, you wanted to say something, right?
Please go ahead. I'll go after you.
Yeah, cool. Jana's kind of protesting remark, you know, where basically it goes against this very idea of competitiveness. Competition is this kind of drive of, you know, the old capitalist value, like, you know, if there is no competition, then there is no quality of the product and no quantities as well. So you stop this competition. But in the NIST report, the symmetrical role is played by the concept of preparedness. What is competitiveness in the Draghi report? It's preparedness in not the NIST report, and these are two very different realities, because competitiveness is about like with whom you compete, how you win it. While preparedness is to what do you prepare, to what you have to be prepared. And you don't win, you just prepare and wait, something like that. It's kind of entirely different kind of intuitive reality. And I think also geopolitical conclusions are also very different from geopolitical sentiments that you get after reading these two texts are entirely different. And they will compete, I think, at some point they will be compared and contrasted. This is what Western Europe people would be reading and debating for months ahead. But it's interesting to see how it's different from American perspective also, where there should be some kind of similarities and harmonization as well. No, please.
Yep, I mean, both of those points made me think about the duplicative nature of some of the investments and some of the subsidies we have going on at the moment. I mean, if you think we have limited resources, then it's a shame to watch all the subsidies being showered on the solar manufacturing industry in the US, and maybe you could say the same for the EU. I mean, probably the world's best solar analyst, Jenny Chase of Bloomberg NEF, says it's a dirty business. I don't know why you'd want to be in this. It's low margins. And if we did have some sort of global coordinating body, it would probably try to avoid the subsidies that are competing with each other in that way and say, okay, well, let's try to focus on our strengths. If the US might be good at hydrogen and carbon capture, and the EU at biofuels and wind, and China and solar and batteries, and we would try to focus on what we're good at. But we sort of are pouring subsidies into the same sectors, and especially in the US's case, putting up some really strong tariff barriers and other barriers, like sort of just banning Chinese connected vehicles and being worried about joint ventures. There's been a funny outcry here in the US about complaining that Chinese companies are getting access to IRA subsidies. For example, there's a joint venture to produce solar panels in Ohio, and LONGi, the Chinese solar panel manufacturer, has 49% of it. And the politicians have latched onto this and said, this is not how it's supposed to work. Why are subsidies going to China? And yet this is exactly how it's supposed to work. If another country or another firm has superior technology, you should partner with them and learn from them, as China has done with European and US firms for years. So something happening in the US at the moment where Americans are struggling to learn how to not be number one. It's this American exceptionalism, somehow complaining that China partnered with us in solar ideas, but being unwilling to work with Chinese tech leaders today. So you do see competition getting in the way and a real risk of the US sort of becoming like a Galapagos Island for electric vehicles. I mean, yeah, I try to think of Americans going to Mexico on their vacation and they get picked up from the airport in their Uber is a BYD that's just top of the line, beautiful car that they've never seen before, and they will be confused about why we don't have that in the US. So you do see competition spinning out of control and actually competition from other areas spilling into the energy transition. I mean, the US restrictions uh, on semiconductor exports to China and has sort of bullied the Netherlands and Japan into coming along. China responds to that in part by restricting exports of things like graphite. And you see how this escalation could derail the Inuit energy transition. I mean, Johanna, maybe for you, you were talking about a little bit about agriculture, and it's been fascinating from the US to look at the European farmers' protests. To me, it's like looking into the future. The US is not even beginning to have a policy on that. I wonder if you've like, what are the takeaways from other regions on the EU's early sort of abortive efforts to rein in agricultural emissions?
Yeah, that's such a scary topic actually with European to talk about that. No, because I really am going to share the answer with anyone who is willing to participate. But I have the impression, but it's also a pessimistic impression, that in Europe right now, the popular perception of EU's regulation is systematically against, I would say, little producers or so because of that, you have this weird mix of very, very strong agricultural lobbies that are absolutely not pro little producers either, but who are entertaining this idea that EU regulations against their heavily chemical production is going to affect little producers. And then anyone who is doing, I don't know, organic agriculture is just struggling. And they're a bit nowhere to be seen. And in the middle of all of that, you have these indeed layers of regulations that are completely contradictory. I'm a French citizen, and just for the sake of the anecdote, the first time I went to Czech Republic, I was insulted by someone because of the how do you say in English, the pack in French,
Yeah, the cap.
yeah, thank you. And I had no idea, and I had no idea when I went in Hungary that they're also producing wine and foie gras, and I was like, okay, I thought foie gras was just a French thing, but no, absolutely not. So this is part of the whole weirdness of competing interest in agriculture in Europe between that is completely unfair and asymmetric and I'm sorry because I don't know exactly how to answer your question. I'm just very staring at the fact that in so many regions, then the anti-EU sentiment is mainly fed by these weird relationships between reality on the ground and EU regulations through this bias of heavy agricultural majors, actually. But I see that someone is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's a bit the same. I think the cap is a very frustrating topic in Europe. And I just went actually to visit some farms around Austria, like some organic ones, some very small, some very big ones, industrial farming. And you could tell they're a bit all annoyed at the cap. Like the really big farmers, they're annoyed because they have to comply on some levels and they have to change some of the fertilizers and then the small farmers, they don't even try to get European subsidies because it's way too much paperwork for way too little money. And so you both have a frustration with it, and it doesn't really benefit much. Maybe some middle-size farms that are like, big enough to make like very big scale, very low, not very many employees, and they still like can benefit from the subsidies. And it's the way they used to farm already. But then the really big ones are annoyed. Like everyone's a bit frustrated. And then every time there's an update of the cap, there's a lot of hope. And it never really materializes into anything any drastic changes. So yes, there's probably like the EU is looking at it compared to the US, but I don't think it's really like, I don't know, it hasn't really transformed yet, and it's really hard to have large scale agroecology or anything different at this stage. And even Austria, which has actually a very high percentage of organic farms, you can tell there's still a lot of frustrations in these organic farms on the ground. And yeah, I don't know.
This is of course a question of subsidies, agricultural subsidies that are huge both in the EU and also in the United States. And these subsidies, they directly go into fossil fuels. So the farms, so they get $1 billion, and they buy fossil fuel for fertilizers. Basically, I mean, the kind of the king's road to decarbonization obviously is cutting some agrarian subsidies, and that which would immediately cause massive and unbeatable protests.
Which is going on right now in the Caribbean.
Yeah, and it happened in France, say in Paris, all this milk drivers, pouring milk everywhere. Like so many times already it was tested, and of course everyone is scared of that. And see, the Draghi report doesn't even mention this. There is no mention of subsidy, agricultural subsidy.
No, there's a different very early debate. Like a couple of economists recently wrote about ways to fight inflation, and they included stockpiling critical raw materials, but also food. And they talked about price controls, right, as a way to both ensure sort of a level, just the bar farmers. You could link it to sort of, sorry, I'm lost for the word, but to give it a sort of a baseline so people know what they're going to make, essentially. So these sort of topics are feeding into each other in a very early way, I think. We don't have a friendly parliament at the moment, and we don't have a friendly council either, but I think this might be something we might go hear a little bit more about in the future. And also be interested to see the developments on the anti-price gouging laws in the US as well, which in a way also linked to producers, right? Yeah.
Minister suggests to call upon Europeans that every household in Europe would have 3 days stocks of food and supplies, 3-day long stocks in every household, which basically like a practice in Switzerland. Along with the well-protected sellers, they have, I think they're obliged to have a week long.
Yeah, probably a little bit longer.
Which actually makes sense in this, time of war and crisis, and both climate crisis and war and military crisis leads to this kind of suggestions, which would also boost agricultural output. 3-day long stock of cereals for every European citizen and canned food.
Here's a question to all of you, because there was this criticism of the Draghi report that most of the references and most of the sources of Draghi's arguments, they're coming from West European or American sources. Yeah. So to add some aspect of decolonization into our discussion. Basically, there are no significant references to Central East European scholarship. So, imagining this, I mean, how do you think Draghi or the Draghi report could have changed if the Central European sources also been taken into consideration? Alexander mentioned, for example, the Ukraine question, that the Draghi report does not consider Ukraine as part of the solution to the crisis of various crises, but in terms of scholarship, how you think, just imagination exercise, how could that have been changed?
It's a question I can't answer, but I did read a lot of grumbling from Polish researchers about that it's too down, it's too negative, essentially, right? And you might also think that maybe nuclear would have a bigger role. I don't know what Francesco would think about that, but the Czech certainly, yeah, I think that might have sort of focused a little bit more on specific electricity sources of power. Just some thoughts.
The nuclear aspect is also interesting. I mean, it's outside of the question, but now Germany has got rid of the last the nuclear power plant.
The Ukrainian war has demonstrated effectively, I think, that nuclear installations are stronger and less vulnerable to the attack than petrochemical installations like refineries. Refineries are, have been burned, and oil tanks everywhere in Russia and Ukraine, while no nuclear power station has suffered. They are intact, either because they are stronger or it's too scary to attack them.
Yeah.
But whatever, they are kind of stronger. They are less vulnerable.
Oh, the Kakhovka Dam, although it was destroyed.
That's Hydra.
Yeah.
That's not nuclear. That's Hydra.
Yeah, but it's also.
That's also. There are three in the chat. Akas
Francesco also.
show us the questions if there are.
Francesco, you also wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something about nuclear. It's plans to- Yeah. It's not a waste.
We don't hear you.
We don't hear you well. Maybe we can mute us for the moment.
Better right now?
Yeah, it's better.
No, I was just saying that nuclear power plants.
The sound is gone again.
Oh,
If you type it, we can read it out as well.
maybe it works right now. It's better.
Yeah.
No.
Is it better?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. Sorry. I was saying that nuclear power plants, nuclear could be seized and the energy produced reverted else. Russia is right now assuming some of their energy produced to Ukraine. So this is also paradoxical events in the war where the territory seized back, is claimed back by a nation, and this soil, this territory, power plants are built. In turbines or solar power plants, but there are also traditional sources that are somehow seized together with the territory, but who are also seized with energy inputs coming from there. And one other thing that Draghi Report is not mentioning that is concerning Central Eastern European countries is landlocked nature. So the fact that they need to rely on other countries to get access to world energy markets. When we talk about natural gas or when we talk about oil, the interdependence of these countries compared to other countries that have access to the sea, like Germany, Italy, South, is absolutely relevant for landlocked countries, center. This is also something that they're trying to do for destination.
I think we
I had trouble hearing parts of that. Sorry, Francesco. But I mean, I wonder maybe I could. I sort of have a question for the group. I think after reading the Draghi report, it's interesting to look at the struggles of Northvolt, right? Like this is supposed to be a European battery, like a European champion, Europe's leading battery maker. It's really struggling and not expanding as it's supposed to. It's in an industry that's crucial for automobiles, for EVs. Like, what is supposed to happen there? What do you think? What is the Draghi report's answer to the potential collapse of a big firm like Northvolt? The report is complaining that Europe has no massive companies founded in the last 50 years, and here you have one founded in 2015 in a crucial industry. Who is supposed to bail it out, if anyone? I wonder if thoughts on the group about Northvolt.
We also have questions in the chat.
Others questions?
Or comments or
No.
There are three
No.
comments in the chat.
I guess not what to show.
But maybe it would be easier to like just get it on the screen now.
Sorry,
Oh,
no,
okay.
there are
Oh,
things-
okay. Okay.
Yeah, Isabella.
Okay.
Yes, that's about agriculture mostly, and that's what is now.
But to pick up on Noah's question, don't you think that the Draghi report is also a reaction somehow to these attempt regulations on the car industry and all the debates and heat that it produces in the industry to just see Europe give the automobile market to China? Well, this is a bit like how the industrialists are feeling right now. So
Oh, yeah, franchise. Apologize. Yeah, okay.
so maybe it's a sly political move to try to readdress this question on the automobile industry. I don't know honestly about that. But,
Yeah, it's a weird thing. Like the Swedish government is adamant and not helping it, and I don't think at the EU level we're used to bailing out a single country's companies. Like that will suggest that there is a transfer, of taxpayer money or whatever you want to call it. Obviously, if you want to achieve if you want more of one thing, if you want more stuff, basically, you have to build it. You have to be willing to invest public funds into it as well. If it's not private capital that's going to do it. And I think core of the problem there is that we again don't have a sort of an overview of the effectiveness of public investments, right? So we basically we have European Commission uses a fiscal multiplier which it applies to everything, which is generic. It's a 0.7 fiscal multiplier, which basically means that all public investments lose money essentially, right? So it doesn't take into account that perhaps some investments do make money, or in a delayed sense. For example, if you invest in education or you invest in the saving of Northvolt, and it'll pay itself back in maybe 10 or 15 years time. That those types of if you approach it more as a checkbox, like what kind of investments do help, then this might change. But the information, the access to information on this is very limited. The openness of the Commission to get in more knowledge, to use different models is also very slow. And I think in this case, Northvolt, there might not be an efficient market sense, like sort of a case to be made at this point. But I think also the Commission doesn't have the tools to sort of maybe come up with a plan to make it profitable in the future or something like that, or make it a core interest to European, yeah.
Bailout may be the wrong tool. It might be a case for the offtake agreements that the Draghi report talks about. I mean, you have like BMW canceling a big contract with it. And clearly Europe as a whole wants there to be a demand for European produced batteries and for there to be big producers. But here you have like a real a chance to put the words of the Draghi report to the test and do something to support it. It's interesting what you say about measuring the effects of investment. That's been a problem with the Development Finance Corporation, the U.S. body I mentioned as well. It's allowed to make equity investments, but the U.S. budget rules treat all equity investments as a loss. So it's just as if they've given away $1 billion instead of recognizing that they could have returns later. And so they're trying to change the rules there. But you see so many areas where it's hard for the US or the EU to compete with China. And on bailouts are an opportunity to take control of companies or put strings on them, which was sort of missed when the EU did do some bailouts during the COVID-19 pandemic. It sort of helped the airlines without requiring much of them in return. So in the next crisis, I think there's a chance to ask more of companies when they come to the state begging for a handout.
That's a good point, that we would have so much trouble saving Northvolt now, whereas we saved a bunch of unproductive companies in 2020. Yeah.
I have a broader question to everyone. Look, so we have this natural this climate catastrophes going on. The last one happened in Valencia. And obviously, this is something new that's going on, like with this sort of increasing pace and scale. And on the other hand, we have all this emissions emissions going on, and these plans of decarbonization suspended or even retreating. So at some point, of course, these two processes will clash, and there will something will happen on such a scale that people will kind of get back to their whatever rationality, because Homo sapiens is rational by definition. But
that's a hope.
But I think we need to sort of try to imagine or kind of reconstruct or predict this order of events. I call it catastrophic learning. Like basically, yes, we should acknowledge that humanity has failed to whatever has failed in preemptive action. That hasn't happened. It will not happen. So the only hope then, the next hope, maybe not the only, but the next, that is maybe the only hope will be to emigrating to Mars, whatever. But before the next hope is learning from these catastrophes. And learning from these catastrophes, of course, means that, of course, okay, this horrible thing has happened in Valencia. So Valencia, so the local community definitely does learn something. They would build a new dam, things like that. Introduce new regulation locally. Maybe Spanish government. So there is this sort of political process of learning that should be comprehensible or predictable. So catastrophic learning is the process that is going into being into action, and something that we need to understand how it works or will work. Because it did not work in the past, but it should.
But is it not like preparing every general prepares for the the previous war, right? It's not about the new war in the new environment, but preparing for the old war with these catastrophes. It was very hard for me to imagine that the COVID-19 pandemic, would be such a disaster globally, as if there was no learning from the past catastrophe, from the past pandemics. There was the flu before that predominantly affected the Asian countries. The bird flu. So it was in a way an exercise, right? But it was not taken seriously then, maybe.
No, but we have learned. All of us have learned something from the from COVID-19.
Yeah, but why haven't we learned
vaccinations
from the bird flu to prepare for the COVID-19 pandemic?
No, that's the whole point, that we cannot. The philosophical lesson is that we cannot really we are not able to, we are not able to do preemptive action. But we could learn from, from the death and suffering of, on a mass scale around us. We do learn. For instance, we are doing this vaccination. All of us would do, and the states and societies and continents did learn something on a big scale from COVID. So I'm like say Valencia is learning right now from what happened there in Valencia. If it will like from Chernobyl catastrophe, we learn one thing or two. So preemptive action doesn't work, but learning from the catastrophe does work. This is basically kind of a subject for, conditions, limits, mechanisms. Transfer of best practices from one catastrophe to another catastrophe. Things like that.
But if you stay in the competitive mindset, then you should not let a good crisis go to waste, and you should make your own benefit out of someone else's catastrophic situation, no? That's the limit of the competitive thinking.
Yeah, that should be the limit competition. Yeah, it's like what Valencia would compete with whatever with Alicante, who would have had a bigger catastrophe. That doesn't work, obviously.
But if you read the Draghi report, if you do like the way he sometimes frames the common good is that you have to go through, you have to prioritize business interests to meet the common good, right? Which is further down the line, because if we don't, then the businesses will go away to China essentially, which is a narrow and weird interpretation of what the common good is. I'd say, right? It's not necessarily the same thing to save a business and then in that way do social policy. I think that's a very neoliberal way of working or thinking.
And here we're also basically finding the technocratic, the utterly technocratic nature of the Draghi Report, where, as you say, common good is interpreted as the interests of the private businesses.
There's a question there.
No, I don't know. If you want to rebound on this, go ahead. I think Noah wants.
Nora?
Yeah, we're ending on a somber note, but Alexander, I fear that there's not as much catastrophic learning from the climate crisis as you would expect. I think if you had told us all 20 years ago that in October 2024 there would be an absolutely massive hurricane in the US just before the election that would put towns underwater that are hundreds of miles from the coast in North Carolina, a swing state, you would expect that to shock people and affect the election or make people talk about climate change in the election. And that hasn't happened this time. I think with the pandemic, it's one thing, but with climate change, the causes are so diffuse, and there's so many links between cause and effect. There's such a temporal mismatch. Even if Valencia never emitted any carbon dioxide for the rest of time, it would not stop a similar flood from happening. So I worry about our ability to truly be shocked by one massive heat wave or hurricane or something like that would change the nature of politics in our countries.
Yeah, and I think rebounding on that, I don't think if you look at Spanish news, it's not, especially in Valencia, it's not actually saying, oh, climate change, what a horrible thing. It's saying, oh, how the government didn't plan very well. And so, of course, we should learn. And, I think each crisis and each catastrophe, you need to kind of readapt your environment a little bit. And as you said, they might build a dam, but building a dam is not a long-term solution. Building a dam is just part of the problem we've made in the past of changing everything around us and changing every single body of water to come through cities, and then that makes a flood like the one in Valencia happen. And I think sadly, it's, as Noah said, it's too diffuse, and it's just, people don't see the link directly. Now when the king went to Valencia, he was insulted that people were throwing mud at him because they're like, oh, you represent the government that's just not taking action for its citizens, rather than saying, oh, this is climate change, we should all do something about it. They're just kind of pointing fingers instead of trying to, of course, I hope after they will try to find solutions, but I'm also, a bit doubtful on how effectively we can enact change after catastrophes. And I don't know, we can see it in a lot of places. Like, I don't know, Belgium and Germany had pretty big floods like 2-3 years ago. Did anything get done? Practically nothing. Very little. And like, yeah.
The Green parties have sort of collapsed in Germany since those floods, which is not what you would have expected.
It might change something in the adaptation sphere. So in the Netherlands, a lot of the floods that used to happen that killed people, that don't happen anymore because we built in all these massive sort of flood areas. So I think that might be the only way in which such disasters actually change things. But mitigation wise, I don't really think it's just not. I mean, maybe if it's not an even bigger disaster, but who knows?
This might be the point where things might change with the insurance problem. That's my hope. Is that at some point, private insurances are not going to be able to offer any of their services because of all this. So it will affect all kind of markets because people will not be able to insure their houses anymore because insurances won't cover flood, hurricanes, fire, anything that actually hurts a house. So I don't know, at some point states might have to collectivize the insurance problem. And that would be the
This is what's happening in Florida and Louisiana, right? This insurance crisis, and
yeah.
the states are creating this kind of statewide insurance of the last resort, but still there is not enough money for insuring.
Yeah, so at some point, because there will never be enough money to insure the world against climate catastrophe, then we will have to rethink not just the dams and but also the whole, I don't know, financial system or.
I think also.
Yeah, that's a good point. You can't financial engineer your way out of this. I mean, someone always ends up paying for the cost of extreme weather. I mean, someone will pay for the payouts that come from the state systems that don't cover people. So yeah, I think there's certainly a big bubble building up on coastal housing in the US and beyond. A colleague of mine is working on that. Sorry, I cut someone off when I spoke just.
But the victims always pay, that's for sure.
Well, I think if you remember, like if you think back on the early days of the pandemic, it doesn't have to be a climate disaster to make us remember that we can sort of invest our way out in a certain way, or we need states to help us. Like if you look at the early sort of efforts to prevent an economic meltdown, essentially, it was we started to allow monetary financing of government debt, which a lot of it went to sort of, saving households, but also a lot of energy investments were made. I think that was a really big policy change that wouldn't have happened without COVID on a totally different area of spending and of government. So I guess it has to be a global event, right?
Well, but in Europe, since we have several states that are willing supposedly to work together, I don't know if thinking of other forms of policy would be.
So there are two parameters for catastrophe: recurrence, frequency, and scale. How often does that happen? And growing scale, because all of us have intuition that at some point people will realize what's going on. At some point, there will be that enough is enough. But how much is that? That's scale and recurrence. I mean, I'm trying to bring it to some kind of social science, this kind of science of catastrophe. I not that I feel that we're ready for modeling, but it would be actually nice to make some conceptual steps to that.
But people do realize, no, they seem fed up and very upset, and I don't know this.
Yeah, but as you see, sometimes they're upset with the government, like it happened in Spain.
Yeah.
It's not about
it logical if you have your government representing your capacity to act, so mediating, I mean, your capacity to act, than to be in. Otherwise, you just get rid of your government. And you, I think
Francesca wrote us a
Yeah,
long,
Francesca.
long letter.
Yeah, I'm trying here.
Yeah.
So, let's say that you can all see what's going on in Valencia right now. You have right-wing extremists on the streets. Pressing the government, the national government, the Sanchez government, it is very active in terms of climate action. At the same time, you are seeing extremists seeing the regional government because of the lack of coordination with the Spanish authorities and military forces.
We can't hear you, but we can read in the chat what you put.
Yeah, it's still unfortunate another.
Working, sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, but yeah, exactly. This is I think part of the problem is that you cannot, or you can explain that these disasters happen because of the climate change to a very limited number of people, because other people, especially who vote for the populists, vote for the far right or maybe for the far left, they will just shift the entire blame on the government, and that is it. And say, well, it's the government's the failure of the government to help the victims of all those disasters and catastrophes. This is not some abstract climate change, because for many people it remains a very abstract thing. They would ask you, well, did those floods not happen in the past? I mean, what's you can't apply this two-part assessment of this recurrence and the scale to every person and explain to them, because with populism they would rather ask for simple solutions. But Connell?
I was gonna say, like, just to build on what you just said there, like that's exactly what happened with the hurricanes that just occurred like in Florida and Louisiana, right? It's because unfortunately like Trump and Elon Musk like weaponized that rhetoric and basically said like, and basically effectively what they did was like they said, like this is Biden's fault because he's not helping people on the ground and whatnot, whatever. Like you can't trust FEMA, you cannot trust these like federal funds, whatever. And no, it's like shifting the blame from like, okay, well, no one's asking like why did we have 3 historically cataclysmic hurricanes when the span of like what, not even 3 weeks of each other. No, of course everyone's saying, or like these people on the ground who've just lost everything, they're going, oh well, it's the government's fault because they blame me. And then also like I guess just from a perspective of like electoral politics, like maybe it's naive to think, but if you are like, if I was like an opportunistic opposition, either leader or politician or whatever in anywhere, especially somewhere like Spain, of course you could use that to leverage and basically like blame the current government and just effectively go like, well, they're not doing anything about this, etc. And then it doesn't really matter if you or your policies make any sense in that regard, as long as you just kind of play the blame game from the outside, blame the incumbent, then you have like inherently more capital, I guess, going into maybe another election.
We're 5 minutes past the end of the discussion. If still want to.
Yeah, it was more like of a general thing of everyone's comments and especially John's presentation and then Noah's kind of on, I mean, I feel like you kind of ended by saying, Draghi was saying no half measures are viable, but his entire report is an half measure. And then Noah, who said like, the carbon capture is kind of a get out of jail card and it's been for years. And I just feel like how do we go from there? Like, because the entire Draghi report to me is very much always what I would expect. I actually haven't read the report, but just from your summary of it, I get the gist. It's like Draghi, it's productivity, it's prosperity, it's continuing GDP growth while decarbonizing. It's very much in line with, his political career. He was the head of central bank, it's like pretty logical that it's what it's focusing on, but it's not really tackling like what the problem is, like half measures, because it is basically just promoting the vision of the EU that's been, let's continue GDP growth as our main factor, but let's try to decarbonize on the side. And then again, not focus on biodiversity loss, not focus on pollution control, not focus on a lot of circular economy potential initiatives, like just very much focused on electrification. And it's a bit what's happening in the US. I feel like the US invested indeed like a massive bill under Biden, but it's very much targeted at electrification and decarbonization and very much left out the rest, which I find I don't know, I study environmental and like science, and I think it's really the issue is that we focus so much of our energy on electrification and so little on all of the rest. And it just feels like Draghi Report just really buys into that narrative as well. And I don't know, it's like open floor. I don't know how we go forward from there. I don't know what we do, but yeah, it just seems a bit frustrating.
Well, there is no chance on not ending this discussion on a more positive note, I think. So let's have it here. And I'm grateful on behalf of the Open Society Hub for the Politics of the Anthropocene for this discussion, for your contributions, and the round of applause to everybody who was presenting and contributing.
Thank you for having me.
You know,
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
thank you, Francesco.
Sorry, we
Thanks a
couldn't
lot.
hear you better at the end.